Hello everyone, let's talk about Chapter 10, The Army of the Lord, from No Man Knows My History. Chapter 9 was probably one of my favorite chapters we've read so far, and that talked about the conflict between settlers in Missouri and the Mormons who were trying to establish their colony of millenarian communists preparing for the second coming of Jesus Christ. Some super fascinating narrative. Fawn Brodie's talent is just crazy. I believe, if I remember correctly, she wrote this book like as a result or during her graduate school studies at the University of Chicago, and she also was in her early mid 20s when she did the research and did this book. That's astounding. I haven't done anything close to that in my life, so I think we need to take a moment to really appreciate Fawn Brodie's just really well-crafted narrative. She's a great storyteller. One of my favorite nonfiction authors is Eric Larson, and I think Fawn Brodie kind of reminds me of his works because she's just so good at crafting a story and making nonfiction just so engaging, which is so awesome. So much of this story has so many juicy bits to go over, and this part is some the events in Missouri, Jackson County, are talked about in Mormon media all of the time. Of course, the story that they tell us is a little bit different. So let's start talking about chapter 10. It's a little bit more after that. The first part of the chapter talks about the adventures of one Philastus Hurlbut, which I think is just one of the most fantastic names. I want to make an argument that the story of Philastus Hurlbut converting to the church, being excommunicated in 1833 for unchristian conduct with the ladies, and his journey towards scandalizing and giving lectures against the prophet Joseph Smith and the restoration of the gospel. I think personally it would make as a dramedy, something like Jojo Rabbit, something like that, where it's both funny and serious. I think that would be a really good movie. So if you know anyone that produces film, have them get in touch with me. I'd love to get involved with that. One of the things that Philastus Hurlbut does is he goes on this grand quest to find the lost manuscript of Solomon Spaulding, who was believed by people to have written a novel concerning wars amongst the early inhabitants of the New World that in many ways and colors and shades was quite similar to what people had read in the Book of Mormon. So there was at least some people who were quite interested in finding out whether that was potentially something that predated or inspired the Book of Mormon. In other words, that Joseph Smith may have plagiarized Solomon's manuscript in order for the writing of the Book of Mormon. Now, I first heard about this on my mission in the early mid-2010s, and I remember people saying, oh, it's so obvious that the Solomon Spaulding manuscript is a debunked thing, so therefore the Book of Mormon is true. A lot of people I think that's how apologetics work a lot of the times, is they say, oh, see, this is just anti-Mormon lies. We can conclusively prove that the Solomon Spaulding manuscript is not what Joseph Smith used to write the Book of Mormon. So therefore it's true, and everything else in the restored gospel is completely true as well. And I think that is a dubious claim. Let me just say that. I think it's lousy apologetics. And I think ex-Mormons do this as well. It's if you can prove one thing wrong or bad, then the whole deck of cards comes tumbling down. And I don't think that that's useful discourse either. I mentioned in the last commentary that I went through a stage of anger and grief, which is very normal and valid emotionally to do when you leave the church. And so I was definitely more satisfied and drawn in to the the dunking on the church sort of a thing, or it's just so abundantly false. I think I still believe all those things are true. I just hold less animosity about that position, so to speak. But I think ex-Mormons, people who leave the church, or people who find themselves drifting away from Orthodox mainstream Brighamite Mormonism, ought to do some thinking about how to shed that kind of binary thinking, because I think we can all do better than that if we will just realize that things are usually more complicated than we would like them to be. So one of my favorite things about Philastus Hurlbut is that once he is incensed and finds, gets the courage to start exposing Joseph Smith based on what he feels are really credible reports from, he goes and visits Palmyra, a place that many people would have known and interacted with Joseph Smith, especially during his treasure digging days, which is one of the most gossipy and juicy drama sort of things. Everyone's got a story about Joseph Smith digging in their backyard, you know what I'm saying? And so Hurlbut goes to Kirtland. He goes to Kirtland, he lectures in the surrounding towns, and he, along with Eber D. Howe, puts these lectures and research and anecdotes into a book, which I believe is called Mormonism Unveiled. It's mentioned later, but yeah, I think that's what it's called, and I believe you can still find and read a copy of that. I haven't done it, but I think it would probably be worth doing. Of course, this is decried as anti-Mormon garbage, and you don't need to read that. That's if you read that, you will succumb to the wiles of Satan, who leadeth the children of men away in chains. But I have to say, that is really brave. Even if his intentions were even if you think he was a bad person or whatever, it doesn't really talk about his personal moral character. But regardless of that, you have to give him credit for having the courage to kind of go into the lion's den, go into Kirtland, a Mormon-dominated town on the frontier, and start talking smack on the prophet Joseph Smith and his various adolescent indiscretions. That takes courage to do that. So anyways, I think that's almost all I have to say about Philastus Hurlbut, at least in terms of the narrative of him doing all of that. I firmly, that is my argument. I think that would make a really interesting piece of film storytelling, his journey and going to Kirtland and writing the book and getting excommunicated, all that stuff. I think would be very interesting to take a look at. So I think, and as much as I'm going to give Philastus Hurlbut credit for his courage, I'm also going to give Joseph Smith some credit in this chapter for his cunning guile. His ability to take disastrous slander and ad hominem against him and use it as a tool to further the adoration and commitment of his base of people is second to none. He's so good. He has the Alexander Hamilton approach. If you'll recall, if you only know the musical Hamilton on Broadway, or if you know a little bit about the life of Alexander Hamilton, one of America's founding fathers, of course, he published the Reynolds pamphlet, which was a document kind of controlling the narrative about his alleged affair, and basically Joseph Smith does the same thing. So instead of telling people, this Philastus Hurlbut stuff is nonsense, this is anti-Mormon, you shouldn't think about it, don't let it discourage you, it's not true, he says, let's read Philastus Hurlbut's book, and we can all laugh together about how ridiculous it is that anyone would claim that I did any of this or that any of it is credible. And so I think that is a genius, Machiavellian. Joseph is so smart. I think that his political intelligence there to take control of that narrative, get ahead of the curve, and inoculate his citizens and his followers against this, what otherwise could have been an extremely ravaging document to the health of the church. It seems like the book makes it clear that it did have a pretty significant effect on people, but Joseph was able to make it, a thunderstorm instead of a tsunami, right? And this is something that lives on in Mormonism today. If as all it takes is for an established faithful Latter-day Saint to call something anti-Mormon, if it gets that label, then you're game over. Like 80% of people who are indoctrinated into the Mormon worldview, if they hear anti-Mormon, if that label is stamped on a book or a podcast or something, then it's just not, it's just game over. The stuff that I'm saying on this podcast is probably enough to earn me church discipline, although I'm already in the process of having my records removed as we speak. And because I'm a Melchizedek priesthood holder, I think Curtin McConkie, the law firm that for those of you who don't know, the Mormon Church is so concerned about people leaving in the modern era that you have to go to a notary public and get your resignation letter signed before and sent to a law firm that represents the interests of the LDS Church in order to get your name stricken from the record. You can go the ecclesiastical route, but for many people that's a humiliating, triggering, and pesky process that may lead to being summoned for an excommunication, which is believed by many to be a really horrendous act of emotional violence against members of the church, so-called a court of love. But Fawn Brodie says that for most Mormons, it was enough that the prophet branded the book a pack of lies. And yes, it is Mormonism Unveiled if you're looking to find this Philastus Hurlbut hit piece, if you will. And it says it was his word against Hurlbut's. That is how it is in Mormonism today. If the Mormon Church in General Conference, in the church magazine, in the church newsroom, if they say something is criticizing the church or is anti-Mormon, then all critical thought shuts down, and they just don't even go there. When I grew up in the church, and even throughout I was a faithful missionary all throughout the 2 years I served my mission, and I never once really encountered any of the resources for a time frame. The CES letter and the accompanying gospel topics essays were released by the church. I want to say between 2011 and 2013 is when the CES letter and the church's response to that really happened. And so I left on I had never heard of the CES letter. There was no one. I wasn't from Utah, so I was less inclined to be aware of things kind of happening in the Mormon verse, so to speak. But that's just, I think that's one of the concerning things about, from my opinion, in the world of Mormonism, is just the lack of people to really dig in and think critically about certain issues in the church. So this is a really interesting story for me to read in this chapter, just because of the fact that it's very much a modern day parable can be drawn from this. I love the quote from Brigham Young that he can be a devil, he can be drunk every single day, sleep with his neighbor's wife every single night, gamble, but the doctrine he has produced will save you and me and the whole world. And I think that quote is so resonant with so many people today. It for many people saying, well, don't you know that Joseph Smith did this, or the Kinderhook plates, or don't you know all these bad things they did, or that he was arrested for treasure digging? And people will, well, I don't really care. His contribution to the theological discourse about Christianity in the 19th century resonates today. And I think that's a fair argument to say that, like, theologically speaking, I think Mormonism has a lot to offer. The problem comes from the sort of hero worship, praise to the man who communed with Jehovah. That's the Joseph Smith I learned about. Or the, oh, how lovely was the morning. Those songs, that's the narrative I was taught about Joseph Smith, is that he is he has done more for the salvation of mankind than any other person save Jesus Christ. And as we're reading through this, it just becomes abundantly clear that it could not be more true. For those who do believe that that's true, I respectfully have a completely different worldview and have come to a completely different set of conclusions about the character of Joseph Smith, who was brilliant. Of course he was brilliant. There's no way that Joseph Smith would have been able to succeed as much as he did despite the milieu of setbacks that he and the early saints faced without him being a genius, a natural leader, oozing with charisma. I think personally that Joseph Smith reminds me of Gilderoy Lockhart from the Harry Potter series in Book 2, The Chamber of Secrets, the fraudulent professor who plagiarizes other wizard researchers' findings and then curses them with a memory charm so that he can steal the credit. I see a lot of that kind of energy with Joseph Smith, especially when he's giving these kind of fluffy revelations, and then when crap hits the fan, he kind of balks and isn't able to actually do any of the stuff that the Old Testament there's no Elijah mocking the priests of Baal and telling them to pour gas on the pile of wood, pour water on the piles of wood and try to light it, etc. Which is one of my favorite stories of the Old Testament. And it does go right after that Brigham Young quote. Brodie goes back to the narrative of people are like, well, I mean, that's great. All these things are happening. Sure, Philastus Hurlbut is a nobody. But, like, hey, Joseph Smith, what about Zion? Like, remember how we're supposed to, like, build the city of Enoch, and we're using these Enochian, the language of the Lord himself, and then, like, we're not even doing anything to help them. So, the Lord says, I will raise up unto my people a man who shall lead them like as Moses led the children of Israel. For ye are the children of Israel and of the seed of Abraham, and ye must needs be led out of bondage by power and with a stretched out arm. I'm not going to get too much into detail about the problematic aspects of the idea of God is on our side. So many millions of battles have been fought. Like basically the narrative of modern European history throughout the early days of Christianity and through the Middle Ages before the Renaissance was literally a series of horrifically bloody conflicts about whose God was right and whose doctrine was right and things like that. Again, like we were talking about earlier with Andrew Jackson, Mormons, of course, the huge part of the arrogance of Mormon theology, in my opinion, one of the things I'm willing to criticize about it is the idea that every event in world and European history specifically was leading up to, like, every major thing that has ever happened in world history was a continuation of God's unfolding plan of salvation, which the center of the world is in Salt Lake City church headquarters. I just really don't feel like that's pretty good. It does mention that there were, at this point in 1834, we've got a change in the name of the church, and that, of course, anyone listening that's familiar with modern Mormon history the last 5 years will be chagrined and crestfallen to remember the silliness, the utter silliness of Russell Nelson's tirade about using the correct name of the church. Now, back then, it probably was the persecution the church faced was probably very real in the sense of maybe being called Mormon was perceived as being more of a slur due to the rising tides of anti-Mormon sentiment at that time. And as Kwaku and the Midnight Mormons so valiantly attested in the recent debate that they did with Radio Free Mormon. If you just Google YouTube search Radio Free Mormon debate with Midnight Mormons, you'll find it. One of the things that they said in their arguments in that debate was that people are vandalizing, harassing, and attacking and burning LDS chapels in the 21st century, so that they believe that there's a strong anti-Mormon sentiment. And while I don't want to diminish the the crime and the loss of property. That's not good. I've talked at length about how I don't agree with those kind of tactics. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any community, at least in the United States that I'm aware of, that is so virulently against the Mormon cause as was like in Jackson County, Missouri. That kind of like, we are going to use the very government of states and the federal government to like abuse and harass and persecute the saints. That, as far as I'm aware, that does not exist. I believe there are 14 members of the United States Congress today that are Latter-day Saints. So take that for what it's worth. Russell Nelson is that is a joke. I'm not even willing to use like nuanced language. Like, he's a 90-something-year-old man having a absolute temper tantrum about Gordon B. Hinckley and Thomas Monson saying that it's okay to use the word Mormon, right? So one of the things about the Zion's Camp Army is this. I thought it was like kind of like the stealth video game section, like Assassin's Creed or Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell, or even like Breath of the Wild Zelda. I'm a huge video game fan, if you couldn't tell. Like they've each got their own role, and every time they go into town, they're splitting up into like groups of 2 and like taking different roads. So that's pretty cool. It says that Joseph was fascinated by military lore. I think by the time they got to Nauvoo, I believe he was wearing his military regalia, like every single day. Like was kind of never seen with that. That may not be true, but I seem to remember that. And then maybe even in this book it talks about that once we get there. But suffice it to say, he was fascinated by military. Of course, the military has power, it has honor, it has status, and it has all of the things that Joseph Smith would have aspired to. And so it makes sense. And I'm the same way. I grew up with my dad. My dad served in the United States Air Force, and I grew up extraordinarily fascinated with the subject of conflict. And my favorite subject as a child to read about was World War II. In many ways, it still is. I love war movies, Band of Brothers, things like that. And so I can relate with Joseph there. There's this hilarious story about Martin Harris kind of baiting a snake to bite his ankle or his foot, and the first one doesn't. And so he goes, well, now we have a testament, like, this proves that I have the apostolic power to withstand death and command the beasts of the earth, etc., etc. And then he does it again with the next snake, and the snake gets him, and it's really bad. He got a severe bite, and everyone kind of gave him a really hard time about it. And it says that Joseph was actually mad. It's, basically like, you're being a fool. You're kind of being a jackass. You need to amend your ways and not so foolishly throw about the gifts of God. But I'm kind of on Martin Harris's side. Like, the one thing you can say about Martin Harris positively is that dude truly believed. It's kind of hard to pin down exactly what he believed, but he had a level. That guy had faith. That is like Alma 32. That guy believed. He believed he saw Jesus in the form of a deer and conversed with him, and saw the devil with the face of an ass or whatever. Yeah, Martin Harris is super funny. It talks about Zelf. Joseph Smith finds these Indian mounds and is picking through the bones, and Skyrim, I was an adventurer like you until I got shot by an arrow in the knee. He said, there's an arrow in his rib cage. This is Zelf. He was a white Lamanite, and he was known. The world, like everyone in the New World, knew of this great prophet. So hilarious. Hilarious. Big meme in the Mormon community. There's a YouTube channel and accompanying TikTok, Zelf on the Shelf. You may have heard of them. That's a pair of people that make humorous and insightful commentary, kind of like what I'm doing. They're probably more talented, at least with the video side of things, than I am. But yeah, Zelf, that is funny. When it talks about the men getting super pissed off about their food rations, and it says, we don't eat stinking meat, all I could think of was Lord of the Rings. We haven't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days. So there's an astounding amount of coincidences that happen with in chapter 10 about the Zion's camp. One of them being the Sylvester Smith character who's kind of giving Joseph, one of the only people in Zion's camp that's willing to kind of call it for what it is and say, Joseph, I don't know if you really know what you're talking about. He's kind of murmuring. He's kind of like a Laman and Lemuel character in the Book of Mormon, always questioning things. Why does it have to be this way? This isn't the right way. And they have this thing where the horses all get injured in one way or another, and then Joseph says, they're all God is cursing us because we're being bickering and murmuring, and so we have to repent in order for us, kind of like Nephi with like the Liahona, right? Like, until you repent, the ship will not steer straight. And says only one horse died, that of Sylvester Smith. And stuff like this happens all the time in Mormonism and all faiths. A huge part of testimony building is having spiritually confirming experiences such as this. I can imagine everyone in Zion's camp seeing the one horse dying being Sylvester Smith's as a sure sign from God of his wrath. And I can totally get why people would see that as undeniable proof. Wendy Watson Nelson, the wife of the current prophet Russell Nelson, has said in a recent devotional talk that she gave, I would go on any witness stand, on any jury in front of the earth and proclaim that my husband's a prophet. I have experiences you hear this all the time, I have had experiences too sacred to speak about, but I can testify that I know Jesus is the Christ. When people have those kind of testimonies, I'm inclined to believe them, but one video that I would point you listeners to is a video called Spooky Coincidences by Vsauce. Vsauce is a very successful YouTube video creator, and this video called Spooky Coincidences by Vsauce goes over the kinds of the whole thing about John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln, all the coincidences about their deaths, how they both died in a theater, or they were both assassinated, and all the different various coincidences about them. JFK was shot in his car, right? But at any rate, Vsauce, Spooky Coincidences, go look at that. It's very cool. So Joseph is getting into it with this Sylvester Smith, and the one thing that everyone else is kind of siding with Sylvester Smith is the dog. Joseph has this mean kind of asshole bulldog, and no one likes him. So Joseph is like, if you keep messing around, I will let my dog eat the flesh off your bones. And then everyone is like, that was the straw. None of the other manipulations or things that people could have criticized Joseph for made people mad. But when he brought up the dog, they were like, that's it. That's the last straw. If you bring the dog into this, then we're out of here. Can you imagine David A. Bednar rebuking President Nelson? I don't think so. I do not think so. And the reason I thought of Gilderoy Lockhart, like I mentioned earlier, is Joseph says, a spirit of dissension pervades the whole camp. I descended to it purposely to show you how base and ignoble your attitude has become. It was the spirit of a dog, and men ought never to place themselves on a spirit. He's like, oh my goodness, he is insufferable. This is so insufferable. You guys are acting like dogs, and the only reason that I was also acting like a dog is so that I could show you an example of how ridiculous this behavior is and how it must cease immediately. Oh man, give me a break. I'm reminded of a scene from Band of Brothers, the World War II docu-series on HBO, where there's an officer that's placed in command, and it's a group of enlisted soldiers in the, I think, 101st Airborne in France and the Netherlands during World War II after D-Day. And the officer is a higher rank, but he's not a good leader. And they get into a pretty bad firefight, and the officer has basically a panic attack, and he's no longer able to confidently lead the men. And the men know that all the enlisted guys in the trenches, they know that this guy is not the real deal and that he's a phony, and he gets exposed. And finally, the guy that they do like, the actual natural enlisted leader of the platoon, the division that they're with, finally takes over. It's a really good show, and it's a really good moment of poor leadership. This is there's a couple instances of like really, really horrendous leadership on the part of Joseph Smith. I'll just briefly touch on the fact that the persecution the Mormons faced was real. There was 1 week where there were 150 houses burned to the ground. So remember, like that's not good. That is bad. So we've got, at this point, Joseph still has faith in the system. He feels like if he can talk to the right governors or sheriffs, then they'll be on his side and see to it that they restore order, etc. But it is not so. Governor Dunklin, I think it is, tells Joseph, basically, you're on your own. The fact that Zion's camp exists means that I basically can't, my hands are tied, I can't protect you. This is a great example of American politics where one of our great traditions is to do, he tells Joseph in the letter that at this time helping the Mormon cause is completely impracticable. And this is a great American tradition in politics of doing what is practicable, not what is morally right. It is more important to do what is politically sustainable than to do the right thing. That is something that America is dealing with this day. A lot of the rioting, looting, protests that are happening in the American consciousness and on the streets and on TV is happening as a result of many people's grudge against the political system that has kind of devoured itself and become much larger than any of us ever hoped or believed was possible. At any rate, Sylvester Smith is not done. They have another fight later, and Joseph has this ram's horn that they use for the prayer call, kind of the trumpet call, and he throws it and it shatters. That is literally a scene out of like a soap opera, right? Like they get angry, they throw the valuable vase or whatever, and it breaks. And so they thought it was an omen of evil. Again, we've got these anti-Mormons that say we're going to cross the river and we're going to kill I will not rest until Joseph Smith's flesh is rotting on a log, and then they drown in the river as they're crossing it. And then again, same thing with the Vsauce, spooky coincidences. Everyone in Zion's camp surely saw that for what it was, which was a sure sign from God that God was on their side, that the wicked shall not have their day, etc., etc. Joseph Smith is also really good at, despite the meager circumstances they were in, which were truly bad, he says, "Boys, there is some meaning to this. God is in the storm," referring to the fact that for one time they were finally able to get shelter in that Baptist church, and I think that's really important. One of the huge things for Mormons when they have a crisis of faith or trust and decide what they're going to do next with their life, if they leave mainstream Mormonism, a lot of the times they struggle to find meaning. This was truly my case. So I like that Joseph was focused on life having meaning. Their worldview had a very different sense of what is meaningful than at least the conclusions I've come to about meaning in this life. But it's an important question that all of us have to deal with for ourselves. I hate that Joseph gives them you've heard me talk at length about my frustrations with Joseph Smith using the voice of the Lord in his revelations to say condescending and untrue things. For example, the Lord says, "I do not require at their hands to fight the battles of Zion. I will fight your battles." It's just not true. The history is extremely clear that whatever God helped them with these little coincidences and saving them on various occasions, clearly, it's like they won the battle, but they lost the war. They lost. They were kicked out. Many people died. It was really terrible. Joseph Smith was humiliated, and basically for the rest of his life, people from Missouri were trying to extradite him and put him on trial. So, if God says I will fight your battles, then he's just a really crappy God. Like, he's not good at his job of protecting the saints. The people for whom the entirety of world history depends on the restoration of the gospel so that saving ordinances can be provided to every soul that has walked the earth, and God like lets them just get dunked on by a bunch of like gambling hooligans in frontier Missouri. This is ludicrous. This to me is so. This is one of the things that is just so not. It is not full of nuance. There's no nuance. It's like God said, if you believe that Joseph Smith really was speaking in behalf of God, and whether it is the voice of my servants or mine, it is the same. Like, if you believe that, then God failed, and that's a really big problem. So, I think hindsight is 20/20. I think it's easy to read this chapter and say, if you're Joseph Smith, why are you staying in Missouri when the saints are dying? I think it's a combination of hubris. I think Joseph Smith really felt, at least at some core level, that God was going to protect them and that the work he was doing, again, there's this tenuous line of Joseph being kind of a conscious fraud. There are obviously elements of it that speak to, my biggest criticism is these like so-called revelations speaking in the name of the Lord. But at the same time, we have to remember his immense ambition, his natural qualities as a leader, and his probably very genuine desire to help the saints. And so why are you staying in Missouri? Just get another revelation. Why? It doesn't make any sense. So, at any rate, that's all I have to say here. This is a really good chapter, and I just got done earlier, before this recording, I just got done reading chapter 12, and that one's really good too. I think I skipped chapter 11, but it looks like it's a really short chapter, so I'll have fun reading that one as well. See ya!